In Essential Task 2.2, we are going to begin talking about the first form of research, known as descriptive research. There are three different distinct types of research that fall into this category: surveys, case studies, and naturalistic observations. We're going to be talking about the purpose, strengths, and weaknesses of each of those types of studies. For this concept map, I advise a vertical piece of paper. I'll give you a zoomed out view in just a second so you can see what I'm talking about. This concept map involves describing what descriptive research is, talking about a couple foundational terms here in the second box, and then the bulk of the essential task are these three columns here below, where we're going to describe the specific types of descriptive research. Again, surveys, observations, and case studies. We are going to begin, though, and talk about what the term descriptive research even means, and talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses. When you conduct descriptive research, you're essentially doing the first phase in research. You do not typically end with the type of research that we'll be talking about today. This is typically the beginning of what can in many ways be a long process that involves many months, many steps, and many different studies along the way. But when you conduct descriptive research, you're trying to figure out and get a general sense of just what is going on. You're not really definitively trying to prove why things are happening or what influences the outcome of certain things, but you're trying to get a sense of how people feel, what people are doing, what people are thinking. You're just trying to get a basic description of what's going on around you. So, for example, a question that a descriptive research technique could answer is, what are ARHS students eating for lunch? That's a pretty clear-cut question, and it would typically be answered through something like a survey. You could also ask questions like, who are people planning to vote for? That's a really clear-cut black and white question. Now, if you went a little bit further on into our later essential tasks, 2.4 and 2.3, you could ask questions like, what is contributing to an individual's behavior? What influences an individual when they're in large groups of people? Like, those types of questions warrant differing types of studies. If you want just a general sense of what people are thinking, you'll likely look at descriptive research. The strength is that some of these can be done relatively quickly, at least some of them. Specifically, surveys can be done quickly, and some observations can be done quickly. However, you cannot prove a cause and effect relationship through this. And that point might not seem important right now, but it becomes incredibly important as we progress through the next two essential tasks. Cause and effect is an incredibly important phase, an incredibly important component of research, but it can only be proven through an experiment. Meaning, just because you have interesting survey data, or you've conducted an interesting single observation, or you have a really fascinating case study, you cannot definitively prove a cause and effect relationship between any of the variables that you're studying. That's an important point that we are going to emphasize in following essential tasks. But now that we know what descriptive research is, the next two boxes here, or the next box with these two terms, is to identify some sort of broad general research terminology. Terminology which we could encounter later on as the year progresses, and terminology that we're going to use frequently in this unit. The first of which is the term generalization. When we talk about generalization in the context of research, what we are talking about is taking the findings of your survey or your case study and trying to apply it broadly to a larger group of people. The only reason why political pundits worry about polls, or the only reason why pollsters even have a job in the first place, is they typically do a good job of taking a small group of people, let's say 1,000 randomly selected voters from a given state, and using that small sample of people to get a description of the political views of that state, or in some cases, the country. And the whole purpose of that is to generalize one survey or one poll to the overall population. Now, you don't have to ask everybody. We'll wait for election day for that. But a well-conducted survey can be generalized. You can take the findings of just 100 results, 100 participants, and apply it broadly to an entire state, if done properly. Another term which is going to frequently appear as we talk about research is the term replication. The concept of replication is pretty simple, and in many ways it is what it sounds like. Most, if not all, of the studies we talk about can be replicated, meaning they can be repeated, oftentimes with the exact same methods, just sometimes with different subjects or experimenters. So, for example, if you read research and you're curious about whether or not you would get the same results, very often researchers will be funded to do a replication study, to simply repeat the process provided by a previous researcher and see whether or not the results occur twice. In theory, you need to be able to replicate in order to generalize, meaning in order for your survey to be considered scientifically valid, and in order for your survey of perhaps individuals' political views to be considered worthwhile, you need to be able to replicate it, meaning another pollster needs to take your method, replicate it, and see whether or not their results are reasonably close. Now, I don't anticipate, and nor do pollsters anticipate, two polls of the same state to be perfectly identical, but if the methods of identifying participants and respondents are similar, then you should get relatively similar results, and the process of replication is designed to ensure that. If studies can't be replicated, then their generalization might not be considered valid. Right. Continuing onward, we are going to be talking about the three different types of descriptive research methods. Whether we talk about surveys, observations, or case studies, they all fit under the category of descriptive research. These each have the purpose of just getting a sense of what's going on, not definitively trying to prove cause and effect, not trying to necessarily answer the why or anything like that, just trying to get a general sense of how people feel and what's going on. We will begin first by talking about likely the one that you've heard the most about prior to taking this class, and those are surveys. Surveys are carefully worded questionnaires designed to be given to a randomly selected group of people. And the whole purpose of a survey is to give the survey to a smaller group of people with the intention of trying to get an understanding about how a large group of people feel. So, for example, if I were to survey Apponequet, I wouldn't necessarily have to ask all 800 students in order to get an understanding of eating habits at Apponequet. If I randomly picked out even 80 students, assuming all 800 students had the same chance of being selected, that small portion of students would do a decent job generalizing the entirety of the school's opinions, and as a result, I could save quite a good amount of time and energy not having to survey the other 720. Surveys, again, are designed to be administered to a smaller group of people in order to get an understanding broadly of how a population, whether that's a school or a state or really any large population, feels. You see this a lot in politics when you try and gauge upcoming elections. Obviously, if you're watching this in 2020, we're leading up to an election, we're about 5 weeks away. But typically, polling leading up to an election does exactly this. Tries to get a sense of how people are feeling for one party over the other, one candidate over the other. But instead of asking all Americans who they're going to vote for, we wait for election day for that. If you ask a small percentage of a population, even 1,000 members of one state, assuming it's done properly, it actually does a pretty decent job approximating how the entire state would feel if the entire state were asked in the poll. And the reason is that random selection or random sampling has been done. Random selection is a critical step in conducting a survey. It's also a critical step in conducting what's called correlational research. That's a term that we're going to address more in the next essential task, but it is worth, when you write this down, to put that into the back of your mind so that when we talk about what a correlational research study looks like, you do recall this connection. But we use random selection when conducting surveys, where we give every member of the population the exact same chance of being selected, and then we randomly pull out a certain quantity of those individuals. I made this point a moment ago, but if we gave all 800 students at Apponequet the exact same chance of being surveyed, we would only have to ask 80 to 100 of them about their eating habits, and that would do a decent job generalizing the eating habits of the whole school. And if you actually did take the time to ask the whole school, your results wouldn't differ by a tremendous degree, assuming the random selection part was done randomly. One technique that I think is really easy to remember, and if the AP exam, for whatever reason, asks you how to randomly select or how to conduct random sampling, this is the technique that I want you to know. You give every student in the whole school a number, so truly numbers 1 through 800, and then you randomly pull out 100 of those numbers. So you get number 8, number 75, number 222, and you administer your survey entirely to those 100 students. Then you look at that data, and although you did not ask the entirety of the school, because each student had the same chance of being selected, this process of randomly pulling out numbers through what's called a random computerized number generator is a sufficient means of randomly selecting. And although, again, you didn't ask the whole school, you are able to take your one survey and generalize it to get a general understanding about how the school feels about whatever given topic you're studying. The AP exam has been calling this random selection for much of the past about 5 or 7 years. It's not impossible, though, and it is often also called random sampling. So if you hear either of those terms, it references the same process. It's what you use when you conduct a survey. It's when you have 1,000 people and you only need to ask 100 of them. You go through the process of giving everybody a number, use a random computer number generator to populate 100 random numbers, and now those are the only people that get the exam or the survey. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word sampling or selection, it starts with the letter S. If you remember that this is the process for surveying, you likely will make this connection. This mnemonic might not seem overwhelmingly important today, but in Essential Task 2.4, so not the one we do next, but the one following, we're going to be talking about experiments, and I'll give you just a really quick preview. But when we talk about experiments, there is a term called random assignment right here. And I cannot tell you how common it is to confuse random selection with random assignment. So it's important that when you see the S in selection, you connect that this is only done in surveying or correlational research, which is very similar to surveying. We'll talk more about that in the next task. I think this picture does a good job of visualizing this. The population is that white circle. All of those sort of orange tinted peach colored dots is the sample, the smaller population of people that are actually going to be asked. In terms of strengths, this is the furthest down the box goes. But in terms of strengths, if you went through the process of random selection, you can generalize the results of a survey, which in many ways is the whole point of doing a survey. Generally speaking, it can be done quickly. If you really wanted to, and we had the backing of the school, we could conduct a randomly selected survey today. And it's usually easy to replicate. All you have to do is provide another researcher the questions and the method of selection, and that individual could use the same population, select another random group of students, and typically those results would be pretty similar, even though it might be a totally different group of students. In terms of weaknesses, there are a couple weaknesses when conducting surveys. The first of which is what we call the wording effect. If you recall back in Unit 1, we talked about a concept called framing. That was with one of the summer videos. The wording effect and framing are more or less the same thing, but when we talk about the wording effect, we're specifically talking about the results of a survey. But depending on the way you word a question, it can yield differing results. So for example, if you ask, should this behavior be banned or should this behavior be allowed? You're essentially asking the same thing, but the connotation of the word prohibited or banned or allowed could cause an individual to evaluate the scenario differently and provide a different response. So it's very important that when you're writing the questions to a survey, you're very keenly aware of not trying to influence the results and implementing what's called the wording effect. You want to avoid this to the best of your ability. The other potential weakness is that not everybody is honest on a survey. Oftentimes, when asked direct questions about somewhat sensitive topics, people are willing to steer their answer in the direction not of how they actually feel, but in terms of what they think is socially acceptable. And as a result, you might not actually get their authentic opinion on a given matter. So if you ask very sensitive questions about gun control or abortion or any of the other topics in politics, if you ask somebody dead on, they might not give you an honest answer because they might shift their response to match what they think the researcher wants to hear or what they think the researcher would find acceptable, when in reality, their true opinions don't match that. And again, the whole purpose of a survey is to get an honest understanding about how people feel. We call this the social desirability effect. It's been a little while, but back in 2016, you may have heard of, and if you haven't, it's okay, but you may have heard of the Brexit vote. It was a vote as to whether or not the United Kingdom should leave the European Union, which just in and of itself was a pretty major historical event, but it was essentially a referendum, a vote of the people. The citizens of the country got to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to be more of an independent country or whether or not they wanted to remain in the European Union. Regardless of the extent that you knew about that or heard about that prior, what's really fascinating is that the polling leading up to that was quite dramatic. If you take a look at the left, those were the polls when an individual was polled online, and it looked like it was a tie, that stay part of the European Union and leave the European Union were in a dead tie. But if you ask somebody on the phone what they felt, remain was through the roof at 54%. But we see this huge discrepancy between what it was like when somebody was alone at home in front of a computer or actually had to speak to somebody on the phone. What's really amazing is that leading up to that referendum, most people assumed that Remain was going to win. It was leading in the polls. On the actual night of the vote, Leave ended up winning. So the red bar ended up actually winning the vote on the night of the election, of the night of that referendum, rather. And people really tried to figure out what was going on. It seemed like the general consensus, looking back at that polling data, is that there may have been some social desirability issues where people in front of a computer alone doing an online poll were giving authentic responses. And the actual vote that night was very close, just a few percentage points in favor of leave. And when people were answering on the phone, although they actually were going to vote leave on the night of the vote, they were uncomfortable on the phone telling somebody that they were in favor of remain. So as a result, the polling leading up to the Brexit was all over the place. Proceeding onward, there are two different types of descriptive research methods. These ones don't take nearly as long to talk about. But the first is what we call naturalistic observations. When you conduct a naturalistic observation, you're essentially trying to find some type of natural setting that's not a laboratory in order to observe either human or animal behavior. And this is very important. It needs to be a natural setting, and you need to have absolutely no influence whatsoever on the behavior of the participants. You need to walk into the cafeteria with a notebook in the back and not directly speak to or connect or react to anything that you see. You're just taking notes. If you're doing a study at the mall, you need to sit at the mall, not speak to customers, not talk to anybody, do the best thing that you can to keep the setting as natural as possible. So we don't take people into a lab to conduct observations. That's obviously not a natural setting. We are doing this in the park, at the mall, in the cafeteria. If we go back to that question about eating habits at Apponequet, we would observe behaviors in the caf and not speak to anybody. And people will act way more natural in this natural setting, obviously, than they would in some type of lab. If I brought people into a lab and offered them a buffet, their eating habits might differ quite a bit, knowing that they were being watched and studied. If I'm just doing a naturalistic observation, though, I'm finding as natural a place as possible and observing behavior. Then I can just report back and get a sense of the overall eating habits. Not trying to figure out why people choose what they eat. Again, that's not what this form of research is for, but just to get a sense of how people are eating. In terms of weaknesses, you generally can't generalize this, meaning you can't apply one observation to everybody across the board. What one lunch does a period might not necessarily reflect the opinions of the school, particularly in 2020 when seniors typically don't eat at lunch at all. So I could go observe the lunchroom, but I would not get many upperclassmen opinions or views or eating habits. And then generally there's an issue of what we call observer or experimenter bias. Even if you are told not to interact with the individuals you're observing, if you know you're being watched, you tend to change your behavior. If anybody's ever changed their behavior because an administrator walks into the classroom or their boss is watching, that feeling about being watched by somebody in a position of power. So that what we call observer experimenter bias could be in play. Or even though you're trying to do things in a natural setting, if somebody knows they're being watched and that researcher's in the back taking notes, even if they're told to act in an authentic fashion and not interact with the researcher, it's really hard to actually do that. In terms of the last form of research, when we have very unique cases, so we're talking about individuals that have incredibly unique circumstances, one form of research that would be appropriate is called case studies, where we go into great depth studying that one individual. And I'm talking almost around-the-clock research with follow-ups into medical records, looking at biographical information, really getting a very deep, in-depth look at that one individual. The example that I give that I think many of you might appreciate if you watch the clip that I asked you to watch last unit is our friend Clive Waring. Clive's really extraordinary memory issues has warranted a case study for much of the past several decades. He's really essentially always being studied in some capacity, or at least was at one portion of his life. And the ability to really hone in and study that one individual in great depth can really yield really fascinating results. We've learned a lot about memory from case studies like Clive. So these very unique circumstances, whether it's a really unique injury, whether it's just some type of really unique behavior, these case studies allow us to have really in-depth, unique looks at singular situations. Some of the problems, though, is you can't replicate it. So like Clive, for example, his brain injury, we're not going to go and injure somebody on purpose just to replicate it. So we have a second person with similar brain injuries. That's obviously unethical. We can't generalize. Clive is really fascinating. Clive certainly helps validate to a certain degree our views of things like what the function of the hippocampus is, but we wouldn't be able to definitively use just Clive's one experience in order to definitively set in stone opinions about memory. It can be part of the puzzle, but we can't take one individual's life and say that's how all humans respond, how all humans act. That's simply not appropriate. So one single case study can be somewhat misleading. And then obviously this is time consuming. if we plan on basically following Clive around for the rest of his life, our results aren't going to happen overnight. It's going to happen after decades and decades of research. So you might not necessarily always have the appropriate amount of time to even consider conducting a case study. But if you did want to get just a general sense of a topic, not definitively prove cause and effect or anything like that, there really are 3 different descriptive research method techniques that you could use depending on your circumstances. If you want to get a sense of how people are eating, a survey is probably a good idea. You could also probably conduct a naturalistic observation. A case study of one student and seeing what that one student eats, again, might be interesting, but one student's eating habits cannot be applicable to the whole school. So that might not be the best approach. But if you did want to study memory, maybe looking at somebody like Clive would be appropriate. And then all of a sudden, something like an observation or a survey wouldn't be as ideal. So it really depends on the topic that you're trying to study. And as we will continue to talk about as this unit progresses, descriptive research is just one phase in a long process, which we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the unit in terms of how research actually looks. We start sort of with a curiosity, a topic of interest. We probably use some type of descriptive research to get a general sense of that topic. And now once we sort of step back and think about what we found, we can then continue onward into the next 2 essential tasks, which we'll be talking about in 2.3 and 2.4.